Heart to Heart, a Catholic media ministry, presents Good News Today, featuring an inspiring gospel teaching by Father Jim Willig.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus and his disciples left from there and began a journey through Galilee, but he did not wish anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples and telling them, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him. And 3 days after his death, the Son of Man will rise." But they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to question him. They came to Capernaum, and once inside the house, Jesus began to ask them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they remained silent. They had been discussing among themselves on the way who was the greatest. Then Jesus sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "If anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last of all and the servant of all." Taking a child, he placed it in their midst, and putting his arms around it, he said to them, "Whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
We launch into today's Gospel, where Jesus is coming down the mountain. Why does it start off that way? Where is he coming from? Literally. He's coming from, if we would have read the context of this Gospel, chapter 9, from the experience of the transfiguration on the top of the mountain, which was a powerful religious experience for Jesus and his chosen disciples, because it was there he heard about his needing to pass over, that is, go through the suffering and death and come into the glory of God. So now he's feeling this mission that he's being given to go down from the high point of that religious experience on the mountaintop to walk down the valley and all the way down south to Jerusalem, where he will face the cross on Calvary. And so we're told, coming down off that experience, he's more intent than ever to spend time with his disciples. And the evangelist Mark tells us that he did not want anyone to know about where he was going. It seems as though he did not want to be distracted by the crowd, because he had so intent in his mind, so focused in his attention to talk and teach his disciples. The closer he comes to death, interestingly, the more time and attention he gives to these men, whom he will be obviously handing on his mission. So Jesus then launches into this great teaching about how the Son of Man will be handed over into the hands of men who will crucify him, and on the third day he will rise from the dead. I would point out that this is Jesus' second prediction of his passion and resurrection. The first, you might recall, a chapter earlier, he was telling his disciples that he will be handed over, and almost the very words used here. And Peter takes him aside and said, No, you don't want to go there. And Jesus takes him aside and said, "Get behind me, Satan." But Peter, of course, is the spokesman for all the disciples and speaks out their resistance and reluctance to hear this message. So Jesus comes and revisits this point again, because it's even more pressing now, and he'll repeat it another time. And remember, numbers in the gospel are more symbolic than anything. To say something 3 times means Jesus is trying to say it over and over and over again. And the point is, I believe, for us, Jesus is trying to show us that our life will be difficult. And this is not something that we easily or quickly understand. In fact, as one person who's been married for a few years said to me, If I knew then what I know now, I don't know if I ever would have walked down that aisle. I mean, isn't it true? Because it's just difficult, and that's why God doesn't let us know. But we need to face our hardship in life. Jesus keeps inviting us to say, what is your cross in life? Can we talk about it? What is your difficulty in life? Can we deal with it? Jesus keeps calling us to this radical honesty of dealing with difficulty when the tendency is to avoid it at all cost. And so we hear in this gospel, as soon as Jesus offers that teaching, we're told the disciples failed to understand his words and they were afraid to question him. My guess is they understood enough to know not to question him. They didn't want to know. They would have heard rumors about Jesus meeting with this opposition that was obviously growing, and word traveled quick, especially bad news like this. They would have been starting to read the handwriting on the wall of this, as it were, conspiracy against Jesus. Of course, they didn't have a clue as to how tragic or horrible an ending this would come to. And they certainly didn't have a clue what the resurrection meant. They knew what the words meant, but even the disciples did not have a deep understanding of how things work out for the good. Do we? Not when I'm facing my cross do I understand how this works out for the good. And so they're intrigued and interested, no doubt, but they are afraid to talk about it. I like to suggest that the disciples, of course, represent us, and that our tendency in dealing with difficulty or conflict is often denial or avoidance. We don't like to talk about things that will upset people, we say. I don't want to upset him or her. In fact, it's already very upsetting to us, right? And not to talk about it is even more upsetting in the long run. You know what I mean? But in most families, there's this unspoken rule, you don't talk about certain things. Or with some friendships even, we're afraid to talk about things. Jesus is a person who cuts through that dysfunction and wants the best communication and to talk about what they need to talk about. I remember being with a family who the parent was struggling with cancer, and she could barely say the C word, quote unquote, herself. And whenever she wanted to talk to her husband about it, he just couldn't bear talking about it. It was really interesting to me, and that was one of her greatest frustrations, because she didn't know how to approach the subject that was so difficult. And that difficult issue, I guess, in all of our lives, what I'm saying is, what is that question or consideration that we need to take care of, that we need to give attention to? We're told then that in this next paragraph, it almost seems like a different chapter in the book of the life of the disciples, because it at first appears totally unrelated. And yet Mark is making a very poignant point by putting these immediately following the other. We're told Jesus is then walking with his disciples on the way to Capernaum. I would remind us, Capernaum is pretty much the home base for Jesus and the apostles, although you would know he was an itinerant preacher, so he traveled around, but his main station was Capernaum. And we're told they walked into the home of someone. Presumably this was Peter. Peter had his home there with his mother-in-law, and they lived in an extended family. If you were to go to Capernaum today, archaeologists have unearthed Peter's house, because it quickly became the very first home church that was established in all the world. And so they're having this journey toward Capernaum, and Jesus began to ask them as they arrive home, "What were you discussing on the way home?" Now, we're told immediately they fell silent because they were talking about who was most important. Presumably, you can imagine this pictured in your mind. These disciples are strung out as 12 men would do, some walking faster than the other, maybe 2 by 2 or 3 in small groups, spread out, but you can be within earshot of each other, and Jesus would have heard quite a commotion going on up ahead. They're really getting into something, and he would have caught some snatches of their conversation. So he caught enough to conclude, oh, there they go again, talking about who's most important. Worse yet, there's a hint of what? The fact he just talked about dying. They're talking about who's going to, quote, take over. You know what I'm saying? And this is the thing that's so aggravating and upsetting to Jesus. And that is the juxtaposition of his discussion on the suffering and death with the immediate follow-up of the disciples' discussion on who's the most important. You see the glaring contradiction of their focus. One giving himself and his life over, the others only thinking of themselves and knowing that they missed the whole point. Could it be that we would be guilty of the same thing? And that so often the tendency of us is to first think of ourselves. I think this really challenges us because I think it's just a human tendency to have petty jealousy. And one of the lessons to learn is, I think, that we can catch ourselves when we're starting to think that way. When we think of dirty thoughts, we almost always think of sexual thoughts. I don't think they're the worst of thoughts. I think sometimes it's all those very egotistical thoughts that are the worst thoughts. And in one area where I learned to catch myself is whenever we compare ourselves to one another, it's a trap. And we have to tell ourselves, don't go there. Never compare yourself. And yet, don't we do it all the time? But when we compare ourselves, we're always making someone, usually ourselves, the loser. And we belittle people when we compare ourselves. So we need to be very cautious of that. So Jesus wants to teach his disciples this lesson. So he calls them in, sits them down, and says, if anyone wants to rank first, then he must remain the last one of all and servant of all. Jesus is direct as he can be, as clear as he could possibly say it. Service is the measure of greatness. Notice he never said that he didn't want them to be great. He just wanted to define for them what true greatness was. And it isn't that he didn't want them to have any power or importance. It's just that he wanted to define what real power and real importance is. And it's all in terms of service. To bring this point home with the disciples in the most vivid way, he takes advantage of this visual aid. He, we're told, took a little child. Now picture this in your mind. He took a little child and stood him in their midst. Now interestingly, he just didn't talk about a child. He took the child, stood him right before them, that they had to look at him. And then what did he do? He put his arm around him. And then he said, whoever welcomes such a child as this for my sake welcomes me. In our Western modern culture, children have top priority of importance. But let me share with you what children were in the first century Palestine, in the Middle Eastern culture, when children were the least important of all the people. To give some background, first of all, it's helpful to know that 30% of the children in the Middle Eastern ancient culture died at birth or shortly thereafter. The high infant mortality rate. So they were even afraid to get too close to them. It wasn't too different 200 years ago, but we're going 2,000 years ago, even more so. Add to that, another 30%, so this is 60% altogether, did not reach the age of 16 years old because of all the disease that they suffered in those times. So children were seen as the weakest person in the society. most vulnerable of all people. They had the least capability of fighting off difficulty or disease of any kind. So, moreover, children represented that person who had no power or position of importance in life. In fact, a child's status was considered practically equal to a slave. Imagine, because it wasn't until they reached maturity at the age usually of 16 did they have certain rights within the family. That's not to say, I need to add, that children were not appreciated or loved. They were treasured. In fact, among the Jewish people, children were the greatest treasure. To be barren without children was the worst curse in life. That being said, they started at the lowest rung of the ladder of importance, though. That's the point. So for Jesus then to take this child who is at the lowest level of importance and priority and to hold him up as the greatest sign was so countercultural and almost unbelievable that it would almost have sounded like an insult to the disciples. Does this make sense? We have to understand it. They would not have oohed and ahed when he held that child before them. They would have thought, you've got to be kidding. Is that who you think we are? You don't think we're more important than that? Putting his arm around him, he says, nobody is more important than God's little people. Let me redefine importance. Let me show you how God sees. And so he then says this last line that's so striking. Whoever welcomes a child such as this for my sake welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but him who sent me. Imagine. Jesus is saying, whatever you do to the least among you, whatever you do to the little people, you do to the highest God. I don't know that anybody has said that louder and better than Mother Teresa of Calcutta. She put aside all terms of importance and wealth and prestige in this world. She's put on literally that sari representing the lowest caste in India, in this caste-conscious society and culture. And she's worked with the poorest of the poor, the people who do not even have a foot up on the ladder, but are left in the gutter of life. And she spent her time there because she believed that person represented Jesus. I'd like to share just one quote that I think speaks what her whole life was about. She once said, "We should not serve the poor like they were Jesus. We should serve the poor because they are Jesus." Isn't that remarkable? We should serve the poor because they are Jesus. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, who are the poor little people in our lives? Can you identify them? Usually most families are blessed to have one person. Most places of work have one person who's that difficult person to get along with, who's a challenge. And could they not most represent Christ to us, who calls out for our love? One person once said, the more a person acts out in an obnoxious way, the more they're crying out for love and attention. Would you agree with that? Isn't that your experience? So I would ask us to ask, who is that childlike person that we need to look to, listen to, and direct our love to today? Let me take a different slant on this gospel. One that I've thought about a lot, especially in my experience in spiritual direction with people. I want to speak a moment about seeing ourselves as that little child in terms of our inner child. You would know perhaps that this psychological term used today to the inner child represents that little child in all of us, because we're all children of God, right? And we never outgrow that human condition. That is, that child within us has certain feelings, certain needs, like any child would, except that there is an adult in most of us that tends to belittle the child in us and keeps it suppressed and covers over those very vulnerable emotional parts of us. And so there's sometimes this war against the adult and the child within our very selves, just like the disciples, representing the adult in us and the child, representing perhaps the Christ in us. Let me quickly distinguish between what it means to be childlike and childish. Jesus calls us to be childlike in terms of being true to who we are, child of God, vulnerable but beautiful in the eyes of God, versus childish is a person who's rebellious and disobedient and selfish and stuck on themselves, and that's all that immature behavior we would say is not at all exemplary. It's not at all what Jesus would be talking about. But interestingly, it's my observation, the more the adult tries to control the child, the less we reach out to the child, the less we allow the child to speak out, the more the child will act out in childish ways. To give the example of the disciples in this gospel, they're acting out in a childish way, talking about who's more important than the other, right? I mean, this is kind of petty jealousy. I would say they're out of touch with their inner child need to feel important. And they're not able to give voice to that need everybody has. I need to feel loved. I need to feel important. I need to feel I'm worthwhile. We all have that need, right? We don't like to admit it. We don't often recognize it and attend to that need, which is sad, because then we neglect our inner needs, our inner child, and we're less healthy for that. And so when Jesus asks, what were you discussing? They can't give voice to it. They can't talk about it. They're not in touch with it enough. Now, Jesus' response to them is fascinating because he invites this little child out into the open. By presenting them with a child, he embraces this child who needs to feel loved, needs to feel important. And he makes that child, by putting his arm around him and holding him up as a model, he says he esteems this childlike quality in all of us. Like a great psychologist, I propose Jesus demands an acceptance of these childlike qualities of vulnerability in us, these childlike qualities of neediness in all of us that needs and deserves our loving attention and affirmation. The point is, the child is us, and the adult is us. And the two need to get together and form a harmony of family within ourselves. Jesus is much more than a psychologist and therapist here. He's a teacher par excellence. And he's saying we need to give special attention to this little person, this humble person within us and all around us. But what psychologists would remind us is we can't, we most probably won't give a feeling of importance to other people unless we feel that within ourselves. How can you give what you haven't received? How can you be what you haven't become? And so I hear part of this gospel calling us, inviting us to attend to the inner child in us first, so that we could stand on the same ground with that child in others. Does that make sense? As homework then, I would propose, can you recognize the child within you that the Lord, I think, would invite out? That is very simple, humble needs. The more we get in touch with our truest, innermost self, the more humble we become. We all need to feel important. We all need to be loved. We all need to have somebody like Jesus did for the child, put our arms around us and say, "You're great. You're great." And the more we do that and receive that, then the more we can offer that and be that for others. So most of my time in spiritual direction with people is getting them to pay more attention to their inner child and to hearing what the inner child is saying. But we parent ourselves very poorly, which is to say we don't nurture our deepest needs. In other words, when we feel certain things, if you're a good parent, of course you know this, to ask your child, well, tell me how you're hurting. Tell me why you're angry. Talk to me. Bad parenting would be to say, shut up. Yet we do that to ourselves all the time. We tell ourselves, I shouldn't think that. I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't. And someone said, don't should on yourselves. We need to allow the child to come out in the open. That is not to say we let the child take total control. Remember, as a parent, we need to discipline the child, and it works together. So as we identify God's little people we need to love, I'd also invite us to identify the child in us. I absolutely believe, as I'm trying to practice what I'm preaching, pay attention, at least once a day, ask the person in the mirror, how are you feeling today? What do you need from me today? It's not bad to love yourself. In fact, it is bad not to love yourself, because Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. Not that we would be stuck on ourselves. Of course, the paradox is, if you don't take care of yourself, you will be stuck on yourself. You'll never be able to move beyond yourself. That's what I've noticed. Amen.
Heart to Heart welcomes you back next week for another inspiring edition of Good News Today. If you are interested in other books, CDs, DVDs, or digital downloads by Father Jim or Father Michael, you can call toll-free 1-877-208-4875 or visit our website, www.heartoheart.org. There, you can also sign up to receive a weekly reminder to listen to these same programs online. And please, consider a donation of any size to help support Heart to Heart's radio and internet ministry. That's www.heartoheart.org or call 1-877-208-4875. Thank you for listening, and may God bless your heart and the hearts of all of your loved ones.
Heart to heart, hand in hand, praying for grace to understand. Spirit of Jesus, open our hearts to live and to love the gospel.